A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
So, Herman, I was looking at the news coming out of the St. Patrick's Day breakfast this morning, and it feels like the office of the mayor of New York City has officially entered a new, and frankly, more chaotic era. It is March 17th, 2026, and while most people are thinking about parades and green carnations, Mayor Zohran Mamdani has decided to turn a celebration of Irish heritage into a platform for some of the most inflammatory international rhetoric we have seen from City Hall in decades.
It is a massive departure from the historical norm, corn. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and today's prompt from Daniel is about Mayor Mamdani and this trend of municipal leaders diving headfirst into international geopolitical firestorms. Specifically, we are looking at his comments this morning regarding Israel and Gaza, where he explicitly used the word genocide to describe the conflict. It is a moment that demands a lot of scrutiny, not just for the content of the speech, but for what it signals about the changing nature of the mayor's office.
It was quite the scene at the breakfast. You have a holiday that is supposed to celebrate the contributions of Irish Americans to the city, a day of unity and shared history, and instead, the mayor uses the pulpit to accuse Israel of genocide. It is a heavy word to throw around at a breakfast meeting over coffee and soda bread. It felt less like a mayoral address and more like a rally speech for a very specific activist base.
The choice of venue is telling, but the choice of language is what we really need to dissect. Using the term genocide in a casual political speech is not just a rhetorical flourish, it is a deliberate attempt to redefine a specific legal and historical concept for domestic political points. As we have discussed before, that word carries a unique weight. When you use it incorrectly or loosely, it does not just attack the target, it cheapens the actual gravity of what that word is supposed to represent in our international legal framework.
We actually did a deep dive on the legal framework of this back in episode 7 on 10, where we looked at the definition of the crime of crimes. The bar for genocide under international law, as established by the 1948 Genocide Convention, is incredibly high. It requires specific intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. When you see a modern military operation involving urban warfare against a terrorist group like Hamas that intentionally embeds itself in civilian infrastructure, calling it genocide ignores the reality of the tactical situation. It ignores the defensive nature of the conflict following the October 7th attacks and the unprecedented measures the Israel Defense Forces take to warn civilians.
You are hitting on the core of why this is so frustrating from a governance perspective. When the mayor of the largest city in the United States uses that kind of language, he is not just expressing an opinion. He is signaling to the world that New York City, or at least its leadership, is fundamentally at odds with the official foreign policy of the United States. It creates this bizarre parallel diplomacy where City Hall is trying to act like a mini United Nations. But the mayor does not have a seat at the Security Council, and he certainly does not have the intelligence briefings that the State Department has.
And let's be honest, it is not like the mayor has solved the subway crime issues or the housing crisis. There is something deeply cynical about a local leader leaning so hard into a foreign conflict when the basic functions of the city are struggling. It feels like a distraction technique. If you cannot fix the trash collection or the migrant housing shortage, you might as well try to solve the Middle East with inflammatory rhetoric. It is high visibility, low stakes for him personally, but high consequence for the city's reputation.
There is also the local impact to consider. New York City has the largest Jewish population of any city in the world outside of Israel. We are talking about over 1.1 million people. When the mayor uses terms like genocide to describe the actions of the Jewish state defending itself, he is effectively alienating a huge portion of his own constituency. He is not being a mayor for all New Yorkers. He is choosing a side in a way that fuels local social fragmentation and, frankly, makes a lot of people feel unsafe in their own city.
It is interesting you mentioned the St. Patrick's Day context specifically, because we talked about Ireland's own issues with this in episode 979. There has been a 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Ireland recently, and a lot of that is shielded by this veneer of moral righteousness regarding Gaza. We called it the Righteousness Shield. Seeing that same energy imported into a New York City St. Patrick's Day event feels like a very specific and very troubling brand of political theater. It is as if Mamdani is trying to bridge the Irish revolutionary tradition with modern anti-Israel activism, but in doing so, he is trampling over the actual concerns of the people living in the 5 boroughs.
The rhetoric is one thing, but I want to dig into the second part of Daniel's prompt, which is the historical precedent for this kind of friction. Is Mamdani an outlier, or is there a history of the New York City mayor being at war with the president? Because the relationship between the 5 boroughs and the White House has always been a bit of a high-wire act. New York is often called the second most important job in America, and that naturally leads to some ego clashes.
It is a fascinating history. Usually, the tension is about money, not necessarily about the mayor trying to be the Secretary of State. You think about the 1970s, when the city was literally on the verge of bankruptcy. That gave us the famous Daily News headline from October 30th, 1975, Ford to City, drop dead. Mayor Abraham Boehm was pleading for federal help, and President Gerald Ford refused a federal bailout at first. The friction there was purely about fiscal responsibility versus municipal overspending. It was a clash of philosophies on governance, but it was still centered on the city's actual needs.
That is a great example of the governance gap. When the mayor and the president are on different pages, the city is the one that usually feels the squeeze. But if you look at someone like Ed Koch, he was famously at odds with Jimmy Carter. Koch was a Democrat, but he was incredibly vocal when he felt Carter was not being supportive enough of New York, or when he felt Carter's foreign policy regarding Israel was too weak. In the 1980 Democratic primary, Koch's lukewarm support for Carter was a major factor. Koch understood that the mayor of New York has a unique platform to influence national politics, but he used it to advocate for the city's specific interests and its specific communities.
Koch is a great comparison because he actually understood the stakes. He was a master of the bully pulpit, but he used it to demand respect for the city. Mamdani seems to be doing the opposite. He is using the city's platform to attack the federal government's primary alliances. That is a great way to ensure that when the city needs a new transit grant or federal law enforcement assistance, the White House might be a little slower to pick up the phone. You cannot call the president's foreign policy genocidal on Tuesday and then ask him for $5 billion for the subway on Wednesday.
This is where the mechanics of power really matter. People often forget that so much of what makes New York City run depends on federal cooperation. We are talking about billions of dollars in discretionary grants, Department of Transportation funding for projects like the Gateway Tunnel, and Department of Homeland Security grants like the Urban Area Security Initiative. If the mayor decides to spend his political capital on international grandstanding, he is essentially burning the bridge that carries the checks to the city.
It is also worth looking at the more recent friction between Bill de Blasio and Donald Trump. That was a 4-year masterclass in ideological posturing. De Blasio positioned himself as the leader of the resistance. He spent a significant amount of time on national television criticizing federal policy on everything from immigration to climate change. He even tried to sue the federal government over sanctuary city funding.
And what did that get the city? It resulted in a lot of litigation and a lot of stalled projects. When you have that level of open hostility, the administrative machinery just grinds to a halt. Federal agencies have a lot of leeway in how they prioritize funding and approvals. If the mayor is calling the president a threat to democracy every Tuesday, do not be surprised when the environmental review for a major infrastructure project suddenly takes 3 extra years. The administrative state can be very quiet and very effective at punishing political enemies.
The difference, though, is that Mamdani is pushing into a territory that feels more radical than even de Blasio. De Blasio was following a standard progressive script. Mamdani is adopting the rhetoric of the far-left activist wing and trying to institutionalize it as the city's official stance. It is a shift from political opposition to what I would call ideological subversion of national interests. He is using the term genocide, not because it is legally accurate, it clearly is not, but because it is the most extreme word available to him to signal his distance from the American mainstream.
It is also a question of the mayor's mandate. People vote for a mayor to manage the police department, the schools, and the infrastructure. Very few New Yorkers, I imagine, are looking to the mayor's office for a definitive legal ruling on whether a military operation 7,000 miles away constitutes genocide. It is a massive overreach of the office's intended purpose. When a mayor spends his time on foreign policy, he is essentially stealing time and resources from the people who pay his salary to keep the streets clean and the lights on.
But it works for a certain type of politician because it is high visibility and low effort. Fixing the migrant crisis in New York City is incredibly hard. It requires complex logistics, negotiations with the state government, and painful fiscal trade-offs. Giving a speech at a breakfast where you use inflammatory language about a foreign war is easy. It gets you the headlines, it satisfies your activist base, and it costs you nothing in the short term. It is the path of least resistance for a politician who cares more about his national profile than his local performance.
Except it does have a cost. It has a cost in terms of social cohesion. When a leader uses that kind of language, they are giving a green light to the more radical elements in the city to escalate their own rhetoric and actions. We have seen a massive spike in protests that disrupt transit and target Jewish institutions. When the mayor uses the word genocide, he is validating the most extreme version of that movement. He is telling the people blocking the Manhattan Bridge that they are the moral vanguard, which only encourages more disruption and more division.
I also wonder about the long-term impact on the city's status as a global financial hub. New York's power comes from its stability and its role as the center of global commerce. If the leadership of the city becomes synonymous with radical anti-Western or anti-Israel posturing, does that change how international businesses view the city? Does it start to look less like a stable global capital and more like a playground for ideological experiments? Capital tends to flee chaos, and ideological chaos is just as damaging as fiscal chaos.
There is a historical precedent for that too. In the 1960s and 70s, New York became a symbol of urban decay and radical politics. It took decades of focused, pragmatic leadership under mayors like Giuliani and Bloomberg to restore the city's reputation as a safe, functional, and business-friendly environment. They focused on the broken windows theory, on data-driven policing, and on making the city a place where people wanted to invest. Mamdani seems to be sprinting in the other direction, back toward the era where the city was defined by its dysfunctions and its political extremes.
It is the return of the ideological mayor. Instead of the CEO mayor who focuses on metrics and outcomes, we have the activist mayor who focuses on narratives and signaling. The problem is that narratives do not fill potholes, they do not reduce the murder rate, and they certainly do not help the thousands of small business owners who are struggling with rising costs and declining public safety.
Let's talk about the president's side of this. If you are sitting in the Oval Office and you see the mayor of the most important city in the country undermining your diplomatic efforts, how do you respond? In the past, presidents have used the power of the purse. They have redirected resources to more cooperative cities or simply ignored the mayor's requests for meetings. If Mamdani wants to play at being a world leader, the president can very easily remind him that he is actually just a municipal administrator who needs federal help to keep his budget balanced.
It creates this governance gap where the residents of the city are the ones who suffer. You end up with a situation where the city is an island, politically and financially. If the federal government is not a partner, New York City's budget is simply not sustainable. The tax base is already under pressure, and the costs of the migrant crisis are astronomical. This is the worst possible time to be picking a fight with the people who hold the federal purse strings. It is a level of political malpractice that is hard to overstate.
And it is not just about the money, it is about the legal and regulatory framework. Think about the joint task forces between the New York Police Department and federal agencies like the FBI or the DEA. Those relationships rely on a level of trust and shared mission. If the city's leadership is fundamentally at odds with federal policy, that trust begins to erode. You start to see a breakdown in cooperation that can have real consequences for public safety. We have already seen friction over how the city handles federal immigration detainers. Imagine that friction applied to counterterrorism or organized crime.
It is a dangerous game of chicken. The mayor thinks he has the leverage because New York is too big to fail. He assumes the federal government will always step in to save the city because the economic consequences of a New York collapse would be national. But as Gerald Ford showed in the 70s, that is not always a safe bet. There is a limit to the patience of the American taxpayer when it comes to subsidizing a city whose leadership is actively working against national interests and using inflammatory language to describe our closest allies.
I think we also need to address the specific misuse of the term genocide again, because it really is the anchor of this whole controversy. When Mamdani says that word, he is not just describing a high casualty count. He is making a specific accusation of moral depravity and intentional extermination. In a city with New York's history and its diverse population, that is an incredibly explosive thing to do. It is meant to shut down conversation, not start one. It is a word that is designed to end debate by placing one side outside the realm of human decency.
It is a total conversation stopper. Once you have labeled an action as genocide, there is no room for nuance. There is no room to discuss the complexities of urban warfare, the fact that Hamas uses civilians as human shields, or the reality that Israel provides humanitarian corridors. It is a binary moral judgment that is designed to incite, not to inform. And for a mayor to use that language at a public event like a St. Patrick's Day breakfast is a profound abdication of the responsibility to maintain order and civility. He is essentially pouring gasoline on a fire that is already burning in the streets of his city.
It also ignores the reality of what is actually happening on the ground. We have seen the data on the ratio of combatants to civilians in this conflict, and by almost every objective measure, the Israel Defense Forces have gone to greater lengths to avoid civilian casualties than almost any other military in the history of urban warfare. To call that genocide is not just a difference of opinion, it is a factual inversion of reality. It is the use of a legal term to achieve a political result, which is the definition of propaganda.
But in the world of municipal activism, facts are secondary to the vibe, and the vibe Mamdani is chasing is one of revolutionary purity. He wants to be the leader of the vanguard. The problem is that New York City is not a revolutionary commune. It is a massive, complex metropolis that requires adult supervision and pragmatic management. You cannot run a city of 8 million people on vibes and viral tweets.
This brings up an interesting question about the future of city-federal relations. Are we entering an era where cities become ideological city-states? We see this with sanctuary city policies, but this foreign policy posturing is a whole new level. If every major city starts developing its own foreign policy, the United States ceases to function as a unified actor on the world stage. Imagine if the mayor of Los Angeles had a different policy on China than the president, or if the mayor of Miami had a different policy on Cuba. It would be total diplomatic chaos.
It is the balkanization of American politics reaching the municipal level. We used to say that all politics is local, meaning that people care about their own backyards. Now, it seems like all local politics is global, meaning that mayors care more about being influencers on the world stage than about their own backyards. It is a reversal of the traditional political order, and it is making our cities less livable and our country more divided.
I suspect we will see a reaction to this. At some point, the silent majority of New Yorkers who just want the trains to run on time and the streets to be safe will get tired of the grandstanding. You can only eat so many moral high ground speeches before you start noticing the city is falling apart around you. We saw this in the early 90s when the city was overwhelmed by crime and disorder. Eventually, the voters demanded a change.
Historically, that is exactly what happened. The city reached a breaking point where the ideological experiments of the past had failed so spectacularly that people were willing to vote for anyone who promised basic competence. The tragedy is that we seem to have to go through this cycle of chaos every 30 years or so. We forget the lessons of the past and have to relearn them the hard way.
The historical friction between the mayor and the president usually ends with the city losing. Whether it was the fiscal crisis of the 70s or the gridlock of the de Blasio years, the city never comes out ahead when it is at war with the federal government. Mamdani might think he is building his national profile, but he is doing it at the expense of the people he was elected to serve. He is trading the city's future for a few moments of activist applause.
It is also a massive distraction from the actual anti-Semitism crisis we are seeing. By using this rhetoric, he is providing a shield for the people who are targeting Jewish New Yorkers. If the mayor says the Jewish state is committing genocide, then the people harassing Jewish students on campus or vandalizing Jewish businesses feel like they have the moral high ground. It is a direct line from City Hall rhetoric to the harassment on the street.
That is the righteousness shield we talked about in the context of Ireland in episode 979. It is the idea that if you are fighting a perceived ultimate evil, any behavior on your part is justified. By framing the conflict in these extreme, inaccurate terms, Mamdani is dismantling the social guardrails that prevent local conflict. He is telling people that their anger is not just justified, but that it is a moral imperative.
So, what is the takeaway for our listeners? I think the first thing is to be incredibly wary of politicians who use extreme language to describe complex international issues, especially when those issues are outside their jurisdiction. It is almost always a sign of performative politics rather than substantive governance. When a mayor starts talking like a revolutionary, it is usually because he is failing at being a manager.
And the second takeaway is to watch the money. Keep an eye on the federal budget cycles and the discretionary grant announcements. If New York City starts losing out on major infrastructure funding, or if federal agencies start pulling back their cooperation on public safety initiatives, you will know exactly why. There is a very real cost to this kind of signaling, and it is usually paid by the average citizen in the form of worse services and higher taxes.
It is the cost of signaling over substance. You can have the moral grandstanding or you can have the functional city, but in the long run it is very hard to have both. Especially when your grandstanding is based on a fundamental distortion of international law and a disregard for the safety and concerns of a large portion of your own citizens.
I wonder if we will see more of this in other cities. Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They all seem to be trending in this direction. The mayor's office is being seen as a stepping stone to a national activist career rather than a job in municipal management. It is a fundamental shift in how we think about local government.
It is the nationalization of everything. There is no longer a separate sphere for local issues. Everything has to be part of the grand ideological struggle, and that is a recipe for dysfunctional cities and a divided country. We are losing the ability to solve local problems because we are too busy fighting global battles that we have no power to resolve.
It also puts the president in a tough spot. If the president is a Democrat, they are forced to either tolerate the radicalism of their party's mayors or risk a civil war within the party. If the president is a Republican, they have every incentive to use the city's radicalism as a campaign tool to show the rest of the country what happens when the far left is in charge. Either way, the city becomes a pawn in a larger game, and its actual needs are ignored.
The 1970s fiscal crisis is actually a perfect example of that. Ford used New York as a symbol of liberal failure to appeal to the rest of the country. Mamdani is handing that same script to his political opponents on a silver platter. He is making New York the poster child for why radical municipal leadership is a danger to the country. It is a gift to anyone who wants to argue that big cities are ungovernable.
And for what? A few headlines and some applause from a base that will likely move on to the next cause within 6 months. The damage to the city's relationship with the federal government and its internal social fabric will last much longer than that. It takes years to build trust and only a single speech to destroy it.
It is a high price to pay for a St. Patrick's Day soundbite, but I suppose that is the era we are in. Logic and history take a backseat to the immediate dopamine hit of a viral accusation. We are living in the age of the performative politician, and New York City is currently the biggest stage in the world for that performance.
I think we have covered the bases here. We have looked at the rhetoric, the legal reality, the historical precedents, and the governance implications. It is a messy situation, and it is likely to get messier before it gets better. The question is, how much damage will be done in the meantime?
Well, if the history of New York is any guide, the pendulum will eventually swing back. But a lot of things can break while we are waiting for that to happen. We have seen this movie before, and it usually does not have a happy ending for the city's taxpayers or its most vulnerable residents.
Hopefully, people start paying more attention to the mechanics of these relationships rather than just the rhetoric. The boring stuff, the funding, the grants, the interagency cooperation, is what actually makes a city livable. We need to get back to a place where basic competence is valued more than ideological purity.
But mayor ensures timely processing of federal transit grants doesn't make for a very good viral tweet, does it? It is hard to compete with the drama of a genocide accusation, even if the accusation is baseless.
No, it certainly does not, but it does make for a better city, and at the end of the day, that is what the job is supposed to be about.
Well, on that note, we should probably wrap this up. Can a city like New York remain the center of the world if its leadership is fundamentally at odds with the national government? It is a question that I think we're going to see answered in real time over the next few years.
It is the ultimate stress test for the American federal system. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that powered the generation of this show. We literally could not do this without that compute.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, leave us a review on your podcast app. It really does help people find the show and keeps us digging into these complex topics.
We will be back next time with another deep dive into whatever Daniel throws our way. See you then.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.